What we need in this world are more and more Dennis Goldbergs. More and more people who say, wherever there is a human being who is being treated unjustly, who is being characterized because of any of their characteristics unfairly, we as human beings all have a responsibility.
Dennis's whole family background was trying to escape from anti-Semitism in Lithuania, the pogroms, which sent so many Jewish people to live in Western Europe, particularly in Britain in the late 19th century, and then goes to South Africa. He's not free of anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism is there also and everywhere else, and dedicates his life to anti-racism. And I hope that in Dennis's memory, we'd remember him as somebody who could have had everything, but chose the other road.
I mean, we think of Dennis Goldberg, the only white person convicted at the Rivonia Trial at the age of 31, extraordinarily, as a mensch. I mean, that's first and foremost how we think of Dennis. What are your,
Well, obviously I didn't know him at the time of the Rivonia Trials, and at the time of the Rivonia Trials I was, born 1949, so I was like 11 up to 15. But my home was concerned about South Africa, and after Sharpeville, my mother said, we will never have any South African products in this house until apartheid is ended. And we lived in the country, and I would sometimes be sent to cycle to the town to buy food and so on. So, and she had a running battle with the co-op because they were still selling South African goods, and she said they shouldn't be. You can imagine the debate. Anyway, so I went and came home with the shopping, and I had mistakenly bought South African oranges. So I was sent back to return them in the rain on my bicycle, and then come home again without South African oranges. She was not going to have them in the house. And so it was just a little reminder that you should always act in solidarity. And looking at the interviews and life of Dennis, you can see this incredibly smart, intelligent, talented young man who could see evil going on around him and was determined to do something about it.
The thing that I always remember about that trial, because of course growing up in South Africa, we never had access to any of that. We never heard Mandela's speech from the dock from the first treason trial. We never heard about the things that were said at these trials, and even being in possession of photographs of these people would have landed one in jail during the apartheid years. The reason he was the third accused was because of his engineering training. When he joined Umkhonto we Sizwe, the armed wing of the ANC, he of course was put to the manufacture of weapons and bombs. And by his own admission, he wasn't that great at it. But of course, everything, all of the plans had been written by Dennis. So when it came to the Rivonia trial, he was the one who could be placed at the scene of actually making the weapons and things like that. So he went to the leadership, who were also on trial with him, and he said to them, look, I'm the one who quite literally has my hands on the bombs. Why don't I admit everything and say that I was the only one who knew anything about all of this, that you didn't know anything. You just happened to be at the farm where I was doing all of this stuff. He effectively wanted to take the fall for all of them. And he was saying, you have grown into our leaders, into our leadership. We need you. If I go to jail, it's not going to make that much difference.
I loved one of the comments he made in an interview afterwards. He said, I don't apologize for anything. I don't regret anything. In fact, it made me stronger and made me a better person for being in prison. Now, he may not have thought that at the time on going in there, but what an amazing individual. And I got to know him better much later on. I didn't know him at all then, obviously, but much later on when he came to London and ran Community Heart and so on. And I talked to him a lot. And I thought, what a brilliant teacher, what an intelligent man.
The Rivonia treason trialists all thought that they were going to be sentenced to death. As the judge started reading their sentence, he spoke about how the only appropriate punishment for treason is the ultimate punishment. And he then said the word "but." And Dennis said, never has a small word sounded so big. He then read out the fact that while 2 of them were effectively being exonerated, the rest of them were all being sentenced to multiple life sentences. But his mother, who was in the gallery and fairly elderly at the time, hadn't heard. So she shouted across to Dennis, "What is it? What did the judge say?" And Dennis describes it as, he said, he turned round with a huge grin on his face and he shouted up to his mother, "It's life, and life is wonderful." And when he talked about, why did you join the struggle? Why did you sacrifice your life? He always said, because I had to, because I'm a human being. And part of that sort of Jewish socialist tradition is about that incredible humility. Here is somebody prepared to sacrifice their lives for what they believe in. And he doesn't think twice.
He also said in one of his interviews that it was kind of Old Testament almost, says, what does it profit a man to inherit the whole world but lose his soul? And that was Dennis, and I think that was incredible. And you're right, it was that wonderful Jewish socialist tradition of service to others, of recognition of the value and good in others. And it's that tradition that is so important in the foundation of socialist organisations and trade unions. Because if you look at the history of the labour movement and socialist activities in Britain, particularly in the 19th and early 20th century, or all across Europe, you found a whole big presence of Jewish socialists all through that period. Yeah. The wit and the warmth of the man was incredible, but also that he was prepared to challenge the directions in which South Africa had gone.
He'd always referred to the ANC as the mother organisation. So he never lost his loyalty to the ANC, but he never saw that loyalty as meaning he shouldn't criticise. He was upset with the economic direction we took. The ANC had been founded as a socialist organisation, and in 1994 we effectively adopted what was then called the Washington Consensus, which was an international variant of neoliberalism. And in the short term it stabilised what were unstable public finances, but at enormous socio-economic cost. And the cost of that we feel today.
That pressure on the ANC must have been absolutely huge. I just remember Mandela when he came out of prison. He went to Havana first to thank the Cuban people. And then he came to London and he had a meeting with MPs. This was not the big formal state visit. This was when he was came as ANC. Yeah. And so the room started off with, I suppose, about 100 MPs in, something like that. Then they gradually melted away. And he's left sitting around a table with Tony Benn and me.
How wonderful.
And as Nelson's talking, Tony's sort of there with his stubby old pencil that he always used. And Nelson sort of looks at me and said, "What's he doing?" I said, "Don't worry, it's his diaries." And Tony then raised the whole question about nationalisation and public ownership of the mining industry. As Tony quoted back at him the Freedom Charter and all the history of the ANC, and Nelson gave a quite guarded answer on this, because even then, this must have been, I suppose, 92, I suppose, 91, 92, that kind of period. The debate was already going on.
It was a very difficult debate, because all the advice we were getting was coming from the World Bank, from the IMF, from the British government, the American government, and we were told there is no alternative. And there so clearly was. And for me, that was part of the sadness, is how quickly we adapted to and adopted some of those global norms. And in some ways, to be honest with you, it sometimes for me mirrors some of the struggles in the Labour Party. Tony Blair came to South Africa when I was a very young MP and spoke about what he then called the third way. And it sounded very compelling the way he spoke about it, very charismatically. But there was another side to it. This party that had been founded for the workers, for the working class, was effectively adopting neoliberalism.
Yeah. The third way was a conveyor belt into it.
Absolutely. And it's a not dissimilar journey to the ANC. And in some ways that depresses me, but in some ways it also gives me hope. In the sense that we saw under your leadership in the Labour Party that another way is possible. And you saw literally millions of people saying to themselves, it doesn't always have to be this way. We don't have to accept those economics. And one of the things I take when I've obviously been spending a lot of time in the last few weeks listening to interviews that Dennis gave, one of the things I take from that is that you continue to struggle and that none of these victories are permanent victories. No defeat is a permanent defeat, that it is always a process of struggle.
Tony Benn said that. He said, no victory is final, no defeat is ultimate. What is it about South Africa that must have included people that had fought in the Second World War against the Nazis, that then levered into power the National Party in 1948, which on a programme which brought in apartheid. And there were people in that party who had been appeasers, if not active Nazis, or more than that, they'd been active Nazis.
Well, B.J. Vorster, who was probably the third or fourth Prime Minister and a brutal Minister of Justice, had actually been jailed during the war because he had been a leader of a neo-Nazi militia movement called the Ossewa Brandwacht. This was a classic election about fear, and the tragedy is that memories were as short as they were. In the Holocaust Museum in Cape Town, they have a wall that is dedicated to comparing the early apartheid legislation with the early Nazi legislation. So the legislation in the early 30s, and particularly 33 to 35. And some of it was literally copied. Obviously, it was Jew replaced with the various racist terminology that was used. I referred to that in my speech in Parliament when we had the motion that caused the far-right wing party that had 2 members in Parliament to refuse to support the motion because they'd rejected that comparison. But it was a comparison. But what lay under that comparison was that people who were proud of the fact that the Nazis had been defeated, who identified closely with Britain, were made to fear the majority of their fellow citizens because they were of a different race. What terrifies me about all of that, it's how quickly we forget as human beings. When I was a student, I ran a welfare agency at the University of Cape Town, and the security services burnt down 70,000 tin shanties. So 70,000 families lost the little bit that they had. And it was, of course, all cordoned off because it was a so-called African group area. But I illegally took a group of 20 students in there to run a relief operation for them, after which the police and army wouldn't let us out because nobody knew what they'd done in this area. And that's where I was recruited into the ANC. I eventually, after 3 days, Helen Suzman, another Jewish South African who for many years was the only member of the opposition. Yeah, very, very brave lady. I didn't agree with all of her politics. I discovered later in life she was actually quite a Thatcher supporter, which depressed me no end because she'd been such a human rights campaigner. But Suzman actually stood up in Parliament and ensured that they let us out of there. So it had been a traumatic few days. I got home to my parents' house and an uncle of mine happened to be there. And his immediate response was, "What are you doing? Are you on drugs? Why did you do this?" And I said, "What do you mean?" And he said, "Don't get involved in this sort of stuff. Just be grateful. It was them and not us." And I said, "What do you mean by them?" And my apologies for the word he used, but he said, "Well, it's the Schwarzes, not us. That's all you need to worry about. It's not us." And that for me was deeply distressing, but also in its own way very, very important, because I think quite a lot of white South Africans generally, and some South Africans in the Jewish community, that was their attitude, was as long as it's someone else, which makes, I suppose, the actions of those we've been talking about even more extraordinary, that they were prepared to to go against the grain in a society that was, in my opinion, deeply psychotic.
During the 80s, I was invited to become a trustee of the British Defence and Aid Fund with the wonderful Ethel de Keyser. This was all about supporting people from the ANC to get them out of South Africa legitimately in order to study somewhere else, or sometimes to study in Tanzania or whatever it was. And the agenda was always like student A to study in location B to study subject C. Okay. And Ethel would say to us, I think A is a really good student, B is a suitable place for them to go, and C is the ideal course. And we'd all say. So we all then agreed to whatever Ethel had proposed. And I mean, in its own way, I think we did a bit of good.
Absolutely. I mean, the Aid and Defence Fund, for those who don't know it, was absolutely crucial, not only in the education of a lot of people who became leaders of the liberation movement, but also helped the families of those who were on trial in South Africa and who went to jail. First of all, for their legal defences, crucially, hence the name. I came across a lawyer in London a few years ago who was telling me that he was a normal corporate lawyer and he somehow got caught into this. In fact, it was through Joel Joffe, who of course had been one of Mandela's lawyers in the first treason trial. So here he was, a fairly junior, young corporate type lawyer who was suddenly being told that he had to find ways to smuggle money into South Africa for the legal defense of political prisoners and for their families. Well, exactly. He had the perfect training and he did it bloody well. And he said, I went from being a sort of a young corporate lawyer to effectively breaking the law to further the cause of freedom, equality and justice. And he says, I have absolutely no regrets, which reminded me of Dennis.
Two things I remember about Dennis. One is his humility. He would do anything. And so when he set up the book scheme here to send books to Soweto and other places in South Africa, and just around the corner from where we are now in my office, he had the shop, Community Heart Bookshop. And I just remember going there one morning. He was the only person there. There was mountains and mountains of books in no order or anything all around. And Dennis is there, shirt sleeves, sorting them out, putting them in boxes. And this is a guy who, mega famous, could have had anything he wanted, even after coming out. But also the point about you make about his humanity and his principles. He wasn't interested in anyone's supremacy. He was interested in all South Africans. And that clearly is where he and Mandela were absolutely at one on this.
That's what his whole life was about. That's what everything he thought was about. He said, very interestingly, you know, again, about being Jewish. He was asked about his views on Israel. And he said,
my name is Goldberg and I'm claimed as a Jew by Jews and non-Jews alike. And so I will have to be a Jew as long as there's anti-Semitism, which means for quite a long time to come, I know. Otherwise, I'm conceding there's something wrong with a particular grouping or ethnicity or religion or whatever you describe. And when I see a people oppressed because of their ethnicity, whether they're Muslim or Christian or secular Palestinians, by the Zionist state of Israel, I have to stand up and say, no, I can't accept this. That's what integrity is about. And coming to understand the interconnectedness between the oppression of people in Palestine, in the feudal Arab states of the Middle East, in other African countries, in the metropolitan countries, the great powers of the world, who claim their magnificent human rights records and have killed millions of people so that they shall enjoy their rights. Forgive my irony. And so I see the interconnectedness of our struggles, and the posters of Hafez sitting here and the posters out of the anti-apartheid struggles are so similar and so designed to build unity, to draw people together. And so I say, you need not just to experience, you need to analyze your experience, and you need to identify with others who share experiences. And you can't stand idly by in the face of injustice.
And I think that this is not unimportant for us at the moment, because there was something that happened on his death that jarred slightly with me. And that is that there were some people who embraced him and his life without really understanding quite a lot of his views. And those very same people have been castigating others for holding views very similar to Dennis's. And, you know, deciding who is and isn't a proper Jew, or who is and isn't being racist, and what racisms are more important. And I think the reflection over this time since Dennis passed has just reminded me of the importance of what it is to be anti-racist. What we need in this world are more and more Dennis Goldbergs. More and more people who say, wherever there is a human being who is being treated unjustly, who is being characterized because of any of their characteristics unfairly, we as human beings all have a responsibility.
Dennis's whole family background was trying to escape from anti-Semitism in Lithuania, the pogroms, which sent so many Jewish people to live in Western Europe, particularly in Britain in the late 19th century, and then goes to South Africa. He's not free of anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism is there also and everywhere else, and dedicates his life to anti-racism. And a discussion with him last year when he was diagnosed with cancer, I phoned him up and we made an arrangement to have a very long conversation on the phone from my office, and we were talking about all of that, talking about anti-Semitism, about the way in which it defiles the history of Jewish people and their struggle, and also the importance of anti-racism everywhere else. And he then went on to talk about Palestine after that, but in the context of anti-racism everywhere in the world. And I hope that in Dennis's memory, we'd remember him as somebody who could have had everything, but chose the other road, that others may lead a life of liberation, but that he also came out of prison in order to educate others. And his talks to, I heard them, union conferences and political meetings and so on, endless patience, because he was basically giving the same speech. Yeah. I know the feeling about giving the same speech every night. But you know, and he would do it for years, and he did it, and never sought to be grand or aggrandized in any way. And I think having the Dennis Goldberg Foundation and House of Hope, fantastic. Yeah. I think that is a place that could be very interesting crucible of ideas for the future about global inequality, about global racism, about global discrimination, and about the economic discrimination that's built on racism. And his life is something that we can all celebrate, and his achievement of being part of that wonderful movement that ended apartheid in South Africa.
He was asked late on in his life, probably just before you had the conversation with him, to reflect on his own life. And he used a quote from Brecht. He said, this is the quote he used: "I sheltered with the people in a time of uproar, and then I joined their rebellion. That's how I passed my time that was given to me on this earth."
Brilliant. Bertolt Brecht. Dennis Goldberg. What a combination!
And it reminds me a little bit of another great liberation leader in South Africa who had a very similar history to Dennis's, who I'm sure you got to know quite well, Joe Slovo. So I unfortunately only knew Joe briefly because he wasn't in Parliament very long after we became a democracy, before he passed away. But when he was diagnosed, he was interviewed on South African television. And the interviewer had obviously prepared themselves for what would be a very sad interview. And Joe was his normal self. He was cracking jokes, he was annoying people, doing what Joe always did. And the interviewer said to him, but how do you feel now? You have a terminal illness. And he sat there with his red socks, because he always wore red socks, even in the gym, I discovered.
Must have cut quite a dash.
He said,
I'd like to be remembered as a person who didn't waste his life, who tried his best to contribute what I have hopefully contributed to the transformation that has taken place. Now, I'm going to die. Life is a terminal illness, so we're all going to die. In my case, I'm going to die with the satisfaction that I've had a rare experience, that I started in the early 40s when there was absolutely no hope. I've been involved in every phase of our struggle, in the passive resistance campaign, in the armed struggle.
Dennis brought it a bit more up to date and said he was in the departure lounge at an airport and he was hoping the plane was going to be delayed.
It's amazing how these people who went through such suffering in various different ways had such an incredible sense of humour. It was the humility you felt when you were in a room with Nelson Mandela as well. I got called to his office one day when I was a young backbench MP, and the office was only about 100 yards from the Parliament building in Cape Town. And even during those 100 yards, I was trying to think to myself, oh my goodness, what have I been quoted as saying that I'm about to get into trouble for? And I was trying to think of something I might have said. I arrive in the office, the president greets me, and he has what looks like a crumpled newspaper. And he walks over to me and he says, this is yours. And I said, oh, thank you, sir, but what is it? And he said, open it. And I noticed that it was in Bengali script. So I opened it, and there was a very thick-cut glass jar that one doesn't really see much of anymore. And there was some sort of pinkish substance in it. He couldn't stop laughing. I mean, he was just beside himself. And I was obviously looking completely puzzled. And I said, I'm sorry, sir, but I just don't understand. And he said, I've just been in India and Bangladesh on an official visit. And at a dinner in Bangladesh, a very old, very tiny lady in a white sari came up to me, and I immediately thought, oh my goodness, I know where this is going. And she said to me, Mr. Mandela, you work with my granddaughter's husband in Cape Town. And the president said, so I obviously asked her your name, and she gave me your name, and I said, yes, he's in Parliament with us. And she said, yes, I know that, I've just told you that. He said to me, she was an incredibly rude old woman. And she said to me, so when are you going home? And he said, I leave tomorrow morning. She said, good, because I've made them some guava acha, and I need you to deliver it to them as soon as you get home. He then says to me, he says, so that was Simon's grandmother, wasn't it? So I said, yes, sir, I'm afraid it was. He says, please do me a favor. Would you go home now with the acha, and either you or Simon phone her immediately and tell her it has been delivered, because she is one of the most terrifying people I met in my life. We're extremely fortunate to have been able to spend time with people like Dennis Goldberg, Nelson Mandela, and others. And I'd just like to say that I think that you have brought some of that to British politics.
I won't stop. I'll always be working. I'll always be campaigning with everybody else, because that is what brings about change. It's not individuals as such. It is lighting the flame in others of wanting a better world.
As I hope this conversation reflects.
Like all good conversations, I've come away from it more knowledgeable, not less.
There's never been a more important time to have a vibrant, diverse, and vigorous alternative media.
And so what I want you to do,
join DDN,
support Double Down News.
on Patreon.